You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Those of the listeners that know me know I'm a big fan of musical theatre. Pitch Perfect 2, perhaps some of the greatest films ever made. Second probably only to Grease or Dirty Dancing. However, it's not just musical theatre that gets my motor running. I'm also a big fan of the theatre in general. I'm also a big fan of ancient Greece. But how do I make them into suitable topics for this podcast? And what can the ancient Greeks teach us about war today? What else can they teach us about the experience of those who go to war and how humans have had to deal with the experience of war for a very long time? G'day listeners, it is Mick, your host from the Dead Prussian podcast, the number one podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military theorist. I actually don't think there are any out there, which makes my job a whole lot easier getting to number one. Thank you very much for your support recently with the new book depository affiliation we've got. So for all those listeners out there that haven't realised, if you go to the show notes, you'll see a little sign that says buy books here, and that will take you to book depository that has global shipping, which is actually everywhere in the world. That's what global means, listeners. And you can buy a book if you go through the links provided by us on our show notes or www.thedeadprussian.com/bookshelf. You will be able to give the show a little bit of love in terms of a commission. But enough about that. Let's get on to the topic of today. My guest today is Bryan Doerries. He is a Brooklyn-based writer, director and translator who currently serves as artistic director of Theatre of War Productions. He is a self-described evangelist for classical literature and its relevance to our lives today. Bryan uses age-old approaches to help individuals and communities heal from trauma and loss. His book, The Theatre of War, What Ancient Greek Tragedies Can Teach Us Today, was published in 2015, along with a volume of his translations of ancient Greek tragedies entitled All That You've Seen Here Is God. His graphic novel, The Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan, currently sitting on my to-read list, is an adaptation of Homer's Odyssey as told by an infantry marine to his squad. It was published by Pantheon in April 2016. Bryan lectures on his work at cultural venues throughout the world and, in recent years, has taught courses at Princeton University, hopefully a hotbed of listeners of this show, the Stella Adler Studio of Acting, and the Bard Prison Initiative. He's a graduate of Kenyon College and serves as a board member of the Alliance for Young Artists and Writers and Friends of the Young Writers Workshop. Among his awards are an honorary degree of Human Letters from Kenyon College, and in 2017, that's this year for those listeners listening to it as it's been released, he was named Public Artist in Residence for the City of New York, a joint appointment with the New York City Department of Veterans Services and Department of Cultural Affairs. During his 2-year residency, he will bring more than 60 Theatre of War Productions projects to diverse communities across all 5 boroughs. And most importantly, he knows a lot about Greek plays and the experience of war in ancient Greece. Bryan, thanks for coming on the show. Now, Bryan, before we discuss the Theatre of War project, which I personally find quite fascinating, I'm very interested to learn more about how you found yourself studying and translating classical Greek works. Was this a field you saw yourself getting into?
You know, I didn't. I was a student. In high school, I wasn't a particularly, shall we say, engaged student. And unfortunately, I really hadn't studied ancient languages as a young person. But when I got to college, I met a professor who was assigned to me randomly as my advisor. And he was a classics professor of ancient Greek. And I signed up for an intro Greek class. And And the rest was history. I took 4 years of Greek and Latin and some Hebrew and Aramaic, and soon found myself translating these ancient texts, these ancient plays that I thought I'd known as a young person, but came to a new relationship with. And then soon thereafter, found myself directing my own translations of the plays, discovering in the process of directing that working with actors and musicians and lighting designers and dancers and others was actually another form of translation itself, and widened the palette of the translator. Of course, even at that time, it was never a career aspiration. It was just simply an undergraduate degree. But I always believed that these ancient texts, these ancient plays in particular by Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides, had a much wider audience to reach than the rarefied few of us that got to study them in university. And so I always had this kernel of this idea once I started studying the plays in Greek that perhaps there might be a way to bring them to wider audiences. And that sort of led me in a certain way to where I am now, which is to say, with this core value and core belief that audiences who have lived the extremities of life, who has faced life and death, who know love and loss and sacrifice, actually have more to teach us than those of us who have degrees in classics have to teach them about the significance of these ancient plays and the core themes that they explore. And that's, of course, what's led me as a translator and director out of the academy and out of even the traditional theater settings and into military bases, prisons, addiction clinics, hospitals, places where there have been natural disasters, places where there have been sort of trauma, gun violence. And the ever-expanding list of projects really is the result of an ever-expanding audience for these plays.
It's really hard for me to work this joke in, so I'm just going to throw it out there and steal it from my co-producer. You mentioned Euripides, so I'm going to say I heard his last name was Pants Off. Euripides Pants Off. I've said it. There's a joke, listeners. That's it. I'm going to get back to the interviews. I've been thinking all day.
It had to be done.
I just couldn't get in there any other way. But it's interesting. It's interesting how your journey has led you from what most people, particularly undergrads these days, would consider something almost very very bookish towards dealing with very real world problems in terms of trauma and loss and service to the community. I mean, there's not too many pathways where people would think translating ancient Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew would lead you towards a form of cathartic therapy for larger communities.
Yeah, no, I guess, I don't describe what we do as therapy. Okay. I see it as a door through which people could walk into many paths of healing. That might be talking to someone they loved, going to a therapist, or going and doing something with their hands, or working with horses, or surfing. The plays and the project Theater of War, began as a formless hunch that ancient Greek war plays that were written by a general named Sophocles 2,500 years ago would have something powerful to say to veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, and then also previous wars. And more importantly, I think more directly, that military audiences who've experienced war, communities that have experienced war, would have something really powerful to say about the plays and to each other after having seen the plays. At the time that we got started, I didn't really know anyone in the military active duty. I mean, I knew a few veterans, and certainly didn't know anyone who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was around 2006, 2007 when things began. And so part of the process was just learning how to talk to people in the military and also establish trust. Because, of course, in the United States, there's a great divide between those who've served and the 99% of us who haven't. Mm-hmm. So it took about a year and a half of sort of pitching this idea. What if we presented these war plays to Marines or soldiers who'd returned from Iraq and Afghanistan. What could we achieve? What, possible discussions could happen that wouldn't happen otherwise? And over the span of that year and a half, I had most of the doors that I tried to open, sort of politely or not so politely, closed in my face. And partly that was just my not knowing how to make the argument. But eventually I met a Navy psychiatrist who'd been in the Battle of Fallujah and had been embedded with a Marine Corps unit and had named William P. Nash. And Bill Nash, who taught me so much, a tremendous amount about what we now call psychological injury, moral injury, PTSD, combat stress, opened the door fully for me and got me an audience of 400 Marines in San Diego in a Hyatt ballroom at a conference on what they call combat stress in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
And I brought a group of actors to San Diego, and we performed 6 scenes from 2 ancient Greek plays by Sophocles that dealt with various aspects of war and its aftermath and its effect, both physically and psychologically, on those who experienced it. And then we scheduled what was going to be a 45-minute discussion with these 400 Marines, having no idea what would happen. And the discussion lasted 3.5 hours. It had to be cut off at midnight. And each Marine or Marine spouse who spoke quoted lines from Sophocles' plays from memory, as if they'd known the plays their entire lives, and related those lines to some personal harrowing story that they'd never told in private, let alone in front of 400 of their peers. And it was during that first performance back in 2008 in San Diego that I realized we'd stumbled across a really powerful ancient military technology, as sophisticated as the architecture, philosophy, art, sculpture of ancient Greece of the 5th century, perhaps more sophisticated because it was born out of a necessity on the part of the ancient Athenians, the 5th century Athenians, to communalize the trauma of 80 years of war, to create a permissive, open, public occasion on which those who had been to war could acknowledge what during war it's not adaptive to acknowledge, which is one's moral distress or the emotional impact of combat. But the Greeks knew, and I think wisely during the 5th century, that for the democracy to actually function, since it was 100% compulsory service, that citizens had to have a way of processing and communalizing the experiences they were having on the battlefront in order for the very fabric of society to hold together. And so we think of theater as entertainment. We think of theater as something to be consumed. But when I think about the ancient Greek tragedy in this context, in front of 17,000 citizen soldiers, all seated according to their tribe, which was their military unit, and according to rank, with the generals in the front row and thrones, and the hoplite cadets in the nosebleed section in the back, I think about how this is not entertainment. It's not even a civic exercise. It's actually a ritual of reintegration that is glaringly missing from our society today, especially given the divide that exists between civilian and military cultures. So when we had that first experience and the performance lasted, the discussion lasted hours, and I barely apprehended what was being said in the room. It seemed like they were actually translating the play, even though I had translated it from Greek. In their own military. It was like if the play was written in a code that I couldn't understand, I needed the military to translate for me. And I found myself within a few months of that first experience sitting in an office in Arlington, Virginia, of a brigadier general who at the time was the highest ranking psychiatrist in the U.S. Army, who was saying, we need to do this in football stadiums for 30,000 soldiers at a time. And I tried to explain to her that was not the scale of intimate discussion, although it was the scale in which the Greeks were operating, 17,000.
Yeah.
And she said, but that's the scale of our problem. That you could do you could perform theater of war for the rest of your life and barely scratch the surface of the number of people who need to see it.
Yeah.
And who need to have this experience. So that led us to embark upon the most ambitious partnership between artists and the Department of Defense and American history. And over the span of the next year, we did 100 performances. And over the last, 9 years, we've done another 309 more. Most recently, we performed in Washington for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all the combatant commanders, so the 15 to 20 most powerful generals, arguably, in the world.
Yeah.
And we continue. Because, of course, we have barely scratched the surface of the audience that could benefit from having this communalizing experience, whether it's from Iraq and Afghanistan veterans or all the veterans we've neglected from previous wars. So that's where we are. And that's where it's led. And now, of course, we have 20 projects that have all grown out of theater of war that all address pressing public health and social issues to this format of live sort of ancient theater, followed by these discussions that are catalyzed by these myths. And everything we've learned from the U.S. military, these audiences for whom we performed, who've taught us how to use this technology in other settings. Whether that's domestic violence or it's addiction or it's gun violence or political violence or prison reform or police community relations. It's all grown out of this initial project, Theater of War, and out of the wisdom of military audiences.
It's quite a interesting story, quite a interesting success story in terms of producing something that is I suppose owned once it's delivered by the audience.
That's right.
I'm very, very interested to find out what sort of response. Like you mentioned, military spouses, you mentioned generals, you mentioned veterans, you mentioned some of the other projects now dealing with other areas of the wider community. What sort of responses did you receive at the time, and in terms of not just the military or wider community, but I'm assuming there were a few skeptics out there about sending veterans suffering from combat stress or PTSD or other war-related trauma off to the theatre. So, what were the range of responses, I suppose, that you were receiving?
I mean, it's been a long time since we've had a vocal group of skeptics. But in the early days, first it was the mental health professionals. You're going to re-traumatize people by exposing them to this material. Then it was the generals and high-ranking officers. This is for the officers. It's not for the grunts. They can't possibly understand Greek tragedy. And then the civilians. This is the proprietary right of those who studied it, or the theater-going audience, not the military. And of course, those who see us as artists skeptically through their liberal sanctimony, that we're somehow co-opted by the military-industrial complex, and by helping people who've experienced war recover, we're aiding the war effort. Mm-hmm. And perpetuating sort of endless violence. Those are all the kinds of critiques that we've heard. The beauty of the form. I suppose the other critique is, sometimes from within, a soldier will stand up and say, this means nothing to me, or, this is over my head. And the beauty of the form of what we do is there's room for all of it. We're not coming to teach, we're coming to learn, and the power of the play is not in some fixed meaning or in some kind of educational objective, but in the infinite possibility of interpretation. So if a performance has gone really well, we've heard from a variety of people, including skeptics, who've voiced their concerns. And of course, the other skeptics are those who don't believe in psychological injury, or those who believe that suicide is a moral failing. Or those who believe that people who don't bounce back from traumatic experience don't possess, quote unquote, resilience, which I think is a double-edged word.
Yeah.
And so there's all those sort of cultural biases and prejudices that are inside the military, but it's also inside our society. I have to say that in the UK, we've actually met with far more resistance than we ever met with the United States. And of course, the critics in the United States are actually a very minor group. And once we started performing and showing a great deal of success, the mental health community got behind us wholesale, completely. And once the generals and the colonels saw that actually, in fact, the plays were for infantry grunts first, that in fact, the closer you got by virtue of proximity to war itself, the more knowledge and wisdom would come back from the audience, even if they were 18-year-olds who'd never heard of Sophocles.
Yeah.
And that's the beautiful sort of upending, democratizing power of these plays, which is to say they are direct experiences which, when delivered well, dissolve the hierarchy. In fact, they invert the hierarchy, where the hoplite cadet is the one who's speaking in front of the general in the ancient world. And in fact, speaking truth to power, and speaking truth about what it means to work within a hierarchy in which, if you've worked in a hierarchy, that you're always going to be betrayed. You're always going to work for someone you don't respect at some point. You're always going to be complicit in something you don't believe in. And so the plays speak to what it means to work inside a complex hierarchy when the stakes are of life and death.
Yeah.
And those in the military, regardless if they were pencil pushers sitting behind desks or they were infantry Marines on the front lines, everyone knows what that means.
Yeah.
And so once people saw that this was a universal experience and that, in fact, people weren't triggered or re-traumatized, but they were activated. They were emotionally present in a way that our society sort of has made taboo amongst their peers in a way that actually was healthy, in the fact that it could validate those emotions in a social way that made them acceptable. The mental health community got behind us, and then the highest ranking psychiatrists in the military helped us author this collaboration, this partnership, and ultimately this contract. And the way the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs has characterized us and our work is as a public health campaign that uses ancient Greek tragedy to engage people in open discussions about the visible and invisible wounds of war. The theory behind our work is that once people have had this communalizing experience of opening up amongst their peers, they'll be less reluctant to pass up the resources that are in front of them and more willing to pursue various paths of healing. It's funny, though, you asked this question about, naysayers and skeptics. Primarily, those are people who haven't experienced the project.
Yeah.
And in some ways, the project is a conversion experience whereby it's very hard to come to one of our performances and walk away skeptical.
Yeah.
But the good news is that people walk in with a certain healthy level of, come on, Greek tragedy. Even if I put a flyer up at a university, I wouldn't be able to draw a crowd to see Greek tragedy read because all of us have sort of been poisoned to the idea of what it is. It's people in sandals and sheets. British actors. 19th century diction. It's not a direct, efficacious experience of war. But for those who've been to war, and then, of course, these are my translations where I try to remove the crust of the 19th and 20th century and get to something that's more direct, it is a direct experience. And once you plug the play into the right audience, to me, it's like an external hard drive. The play knows what to do, and the audience knows what to do in return. And what people, by and large, report experiencing isn't grief or being re-traumatized or sort of sent home wallowing in the futility of our existence. It's actually relief and camaraderie and connection and joy to be facing the darkest aspects of humanity, the darkest aspects of war, not alone in your car or in your closet or in your bedroom, but as a community. And that's what the Greeks know and knew that we didn't, and we just lost touch with as a culture. And our media, although they have united us in sort of untold ways, and we're just learning how we're connecting across the world, we're also more separate than we've ever been, more segregated. And so even if it were simply a pretext to get together for 2 hours and simply listen to each other, we could accomplish a great deal. But the beauty is, through these plays and through the actors going to these emotional extremes in their portrayal of these characters who've experienced, by and large, betrayal, shame, and guilt, we create environments where people can acknowledge the betrayals, the shame, the guilt that they felt, as well as the love and the connection and the camaraderie and the joy that they felt alongside those emotions.
I do like the line where connected but separated. I like to think of it. New media has actually benefited this show quite a lot. So listeners, make sure you follow us on Twitter. But it is almost a connection in isolation where we're removing some of the human elements of interaction, which leads me completely indirectly to my next question.
Sure.
Which gets right down to the business of the plays. I'm really interested to know which of Sophocles' plays has been the one that has resonated the most, and why it has.
Well, we do two plays of Sophocles kind of in repertory. One is Ajax, and one is called Philoctetes, or I think you guys say Philoctetes.
Yeah,
and both resonate in different ways, but both are the core, sort of fundamental, backbone of theater of war. Ajax, which is about a decorated warrior who in the 9th year of the Trojan War loses his best friend Achilles in battle, is betrayed by his commands when they, instead of offering him Achilles' armor, give it to Odysseus, who is not a frontline warrior, but someone who wins from the rear through strategy. Ajax comes unglued and, filled with rage, tries to kill his commanding officers and ends up killing animals instead because he's blinded by madness by Athena. And in so doing, when he wakes up from this dissociative state and realizes what he has done against the pleading of his family and his wife, he takes his life on stage. And then the second half of the play is about what happens to his body and what happens to his honor and what happens to his family and this big debate that happens on stage. Classicists call Ajax a problem play. Scholars do, because they don't understand. They have a problem understanding why the body of Ajax is left on stage for the second half of the play. But no one who's experienced military service, or is a dependent on a military service member, or is a loved one, has any question or has any problem understanding the second half of the play. And so, the one thing at the center of this play is betrayal, and the way that betrayal fuels rage, and the way rage leads to shame, and the way shame leads to the betrayal of self. And it becomes this, in the actor's portrayal of Ajax's rage, it becomes this universal experience that seems to cut across all military service. And soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors, Coast Guard, they all seem to relate to this rage. That, to me, is the byproduct of betrayal, which it seems Sophocles is saying in the play, above all other wounds, betrayal is the wound that cuts the deepest. And we now know this is true. I mean, we don't have, it's a big debate within this sort of mental health community as to what to call it. It's taken us 2,500 years to come up with an acronym, PTS or PTSD. But now we see that the limitations of an acronym describing a sort of psychophysical response to trauma and traumatic events, when in fact, some of the things that people are struggling with are of a moral and a spiritual dimension. And the plays speak to that. When Ajax kills himself on stage, he's calling out to his gods. He's also forsaken his gods and cursed them. He is utterly alone. And the other thing that Sophocles does in this play, Ajax, is he not only stages the violence of the suicide on stage, and violence was never staged in Greek tragedy. It was always off stage and then reported by a messenger. But Sophocles brings the actor out and has him impale himself on Hector's sword the
Mm-hmm.
feet of other generals who would have been seated in that audience. In addition to that, he takes us through the insidious logic of someone who is thinking about taking his own life.
Yeah.
And not only does he take us through the logic, he shows us how rational it actually is.
Yeah.
It's not crazy. It's actually very well thought through. And when someone, Ajax is called unbendable in the Greek, inflexible.
Yeah.
Someone recently pointed out at a performance his notions of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a warrior, what it means to be human are inflexible.
Yeah.
He has internalized this honor society, this system, and he sees no way out but death before dishonor. And that is a theme that cuts across military experience. People understand where he's coming from. So that when people make facile arguments like people who think about suicide are weak, the play throws something up in their face. Here's the strongest warrior in the entire Greek army, and he's going through the greatest struggle of his life on stage right in front of us. This isn't his weakest moment. This is actually the hardest trial that he has ever passed through.
Yeah.
And what's most striking about it is his ambivalence right before he dies. He says, "I'll miss the light of day and the sacred fields of Salamis where I played as a boy, great Athens and all my friends." In that moment, you hear him not wanting to die. And I think a lot of people understand now that this is not a fait accompli. This is not just a chain reaction. This is someone who is actively struggling on stage in front of us. So look, in the United States, our statistics, I don't like throwing out statistics because they're always changed. But of course, there was the VA study that said 22 veterans take their own lives every day. Recently, I saw that it was 20. Regardless, that's close to a veteran an hour every day of the year.
Yep.
And so, Ajax, of course, is the play that has resonated most deeply with military audiences and also with civilian audiences who are concerned about this question.
Yep.
And, of course, the other play we perform, which I won't belabor, is about a veteran who's abandoned on an island on account of a chronic illness that he contracts on the way to the war.
Mm-hmm.
And 9 years later, the Greeks learn that they have to go back and get him in order to win the war. And the play is about how he overcomes the shame and resentment he feels at the very people, the very system that betrayed him. In order to actually receive help, he actually has to get over that shame and resentment of the betrayal. Again, another betrayal. And, we have a lot of veterans in our country who feel betrayed in a lot of different ways across the world.
Mm-hmm.
Betrayed by societies that, don't see them or hear them. Betrayed by countries that don't even have a social safety net for veterans. We've been in the UK, over in England a lot, and all of the mental health is provided by charity over there. And of course betrayed by the Veterans Administration. People feeling like they've been betrayed by long lines and bureaucracy, and so both plays resonate really powerfully. I couldn't pick one over the other because they both speak with such urgency to the present moment. And, this sounds like hyperbole, but for me, it feels like they're more relevant now than they were in their own time, because through modern warfare and also through modern medicine, we've created the conditions to prolong life.
Yeah.
40,000 veterans who would have died in any other conflict survived because of modern medicine.
Yeah.
In these last two wars. But we've also, by virtue of that, generated the conditions to prolong agony, whether that's spiritual, psychological, or physical. And we've created this sort of vast subclass of people and caregivers who are stranded on islands of chronic illness, like this character of Heraclitus. And we have this sort of enduring question of how do we get them back off those islands and into the company of their friends when they feel betrayed. How do we build trust again? How do we engage them? How do we bring them home? And so those are the core questions at the center of the plays that we perform, and why they're so effective with both military and civilian audiences.
It's quite a success story, taking something that was written, for my listeners out there that don't know much about ancient Greece. It was a few years ago. Not enough that it can't be remembered, but it's something that most people wouldn't have thought to apply to this area. and there's also plans for the project in the future as well in terms of helping communities deal with trauma and loss. Can you let us know what sort of plans you have for the Theatre of War project?
We have a lot of plans. I mean, right now I'm serving as artist in residence, public artist in residence for New York City, and that's turned New York City into our laboratory.
Awesome.
And it means we're going really deep into vulnerable populations and communities that have experienced various types of trauma.
Yeah.
It seems like the most singular, universal experience for those who've experienced trauma is the feeling that no one can possibly understand my experience except the people who were at the exact place, the exact time I was when I experienced the trauma.
Yeah.
And theater as a medium, especially tragedy, I think it was designed to do this, kind of breaks down that feeling, which is a totally reasonable feeling to have. It's a sort of human response to pain, the isolation that it causes. So we're now applying this technology in other ways. And so in the last year, we have developed four new projects, and we have 4 more on the slate for next year. And the most recent ones deal with issues in the United States that are as pressing, but also reaching and applying to wider and wider populations. So one of the projects deals with police-community relations. It's a project called Antigone and Ferguson,
Yep.
where we performed Sophocles' Antigone with a 35-person gospel choir, singing the choruses of Antigone set to gospel music, and half the choir members are police officers and half are activists and members of the faith community.
Yeah.
And we premiered it on the stage where Michael Brown graduated from high school.
Yeah.
In Ferguson, Missouri. Mike Brown being the African-American youth who was killed unarmed by a white police officer 2 years ago. And that project has now toured the United States and continues to tour Baltimore, Brooklyn, all kinds of communities. And even this summer we performed it in Athens, where we brought the entire choir from Ferguson in St. Louis over to Athens. We have a project on gun violence where we do Euripides' Madness of Hercules or Heraclitus in housing projects and Baptist churches and communities that have experienced enormous amounts of violence. And it's a play about an unthinkable act of violence written 2,500 years ago, but it's also a play about how communities can respond to violence.
Yeah.
And what our responsibility is when unthinkable violence takes place. And then most recently we turned our hands to a relatively contemporary text, which is a sermon by Dr. Martin Luther King that was delivered 2 months before he was killed. It was his final sermon. It's called The Drum Major Instinct, and we got the rights from the King estate to be performing it in various places. And again, we bring our choir from St. Louis. It includes police officers and teachers and some of Michael Brown's teachers. 3 of them are in the choir. And we perform this late King sermon to engage both the left and the right in these powerful questions that he sort of left this world asking about systems of oppression, white supremacy, the military-industrial complex, the war question, police, all the things that we're interested in as culture now that are like at the center of our society and debate were in this speech. But not being an ancient text, it still has the distance of time because this year is the 50th anniversary of King's death. And so it begs the question, how far have we come? And how far do we have to go? So those are the kinds of projects that we're doing that, grew out of Theatre of War. But in the next year, we'll be doing a project on the refugee crisis in Greece with a play by Aeschylus called The Suppliants. We just premiered a new project called The Theatre of Law about
brilliant.
Those who've felt disenfranchised by the law, but also the moral distress of executing the law and prosecuting the law. And we did that recently in the Manhattan DA's office here in New York City, and we're expecting very soon to have a confirmed date to perform for the Supreme Court of the United States.
Excellent.
So we're making the rounds, and and someday we'll come to Australia.
Yeah.
But no plans as of yet. But it's a really exciting time. And of course, we continue to perform theater of war because its urgency is no less. In fact, in some ways, since the half-life of trauma seems to be decades, the work has only just begun.
Well, if you do come to Australia and you need a mediocre podcast host to read some lines, just let me know.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. I appreciate that.
Bryan, I could sit here talking about the thespian ways all morning, because it's morning where I am. I'm actually in the future. You're in the past. I'm in November already. But my listeners are hanging out for your response to the final question. Now, this final question is one I ask all guests. It relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like big Karl von Clausewitz, the dead Prussian himself, did back in the 19th century. And I ask each guest to finish a sentence. So I'm asking you to finish the sentence, war is...
the father of all things, which is Heraclitus, polymos pater panton. And I didn't understand it when I was a student of Greek. But the more we perform, the more I see that whether we like it or not, many of the great advancements of the 5th century BC, like ancient Greek theater, were forged in the crucible of 80 years of war.
Yeah.
And there is a vital and direct reciprocity between some of the things that make us most human and some of the things that we do that are completely inhumane. And I think when I started this process and this project, I thought I could distance myself from war and be supportive of veterans at the same time. But what I've learned over 9 years is that all of our hands are stained with the blood of war. And you can't distance yourself from it if your country... I mean, you can live off the grid. And
Yeah.
I respect those people. Those people who don't pay taxes and live off the grid, I think even veterans respect. Yeah, that's cool. Like, you can definitely do that. But for those of us who live and enjoy modernity and electricity, I think for many of our civilian audiences, the consciousness raising realization of the center of these plays is that the blood is already on our hands.
Yeah.
And in order to actually engage human to human, we have to actually approach each other with a humility and understanding that you can't say to the veteran, the pollution is yours. And in a certain way, that means that some of the greatest humanistic achievements wouldn't have happened were it not for war, and that's a scary thought. But it's one I think we need to reckon with and wrestle with. And for me, that's what Heraclitus's aphorism, "War is the father of all things," raises.
It's a new definition for us. It's quite good. It's very relevant to the interview, which is good. Not all of our guests nail the final sentence, which some of them just seek plagiarism without explaining it as well. So it's good that you've justified your plagiarism. I'll accept it. For those listeners looking for a book, War, What Is It Good For by Ian Morris actually explores a lot of the concepts Bryan just raised, but make sure you read it after you read Bryan's book. I've read them both, and Bryan's book's shorter, if that helps anyone decide.
Yeah.
Look, Bryan, this week coming up, you have some events happening. New York City public artist in residence. In your role, you are presenting a free Veterans Week events at the Queen's Public Library on November the 4th. The 9/11 Memorial Museum on November the 8th, and the David Rubenstein Atrium at Lincoln Center, November the 9th. And each of these events will serve as a catalyst for powerful dialogue about the unique challenges faced by veterans, military families, and survivors of the 9/11 attacks, including issues such as domestic violence, survivor's guilt, and other mental health concerns. Of course, you knew that, but maybe some of our listeners now will be able to get along to those events.
Yeah, please come. All of the information about those events can be found on our website for New York City, which is theaterofwar.nyc. And that's theater the American way, ER. And then for events around the country and the world, theaterofwar.com.
Excellent. So now that you've plugged your website, I don't have to do it. That's brilliant. I'll just go ahead and plug your book. So for those people looking to learn more about this, Bryan's book, Theatre of War, I can't recommend it more highly. I also had a listen to the audiobook version of it, which is actually, I found, a more enjoyable experience. It's almost like Bryan knows a little bit about the oratory arts. Bryan, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Now, listeners, make sure you get behind us, support us in any way you can. Why? Because I am attention hungry. You can find our merchandise. Jump on our Facebook page and you'll find our merchandise. I'll also be flogging quite a bit of merchandise on Twitter. It is high-priced, high quality, not overpriced for all those naysayers. We've also got the new book of depository affiliation. Go through the bookshelf on our website and you can find yourself some good reads on there. I recommend for this month you read The Theatre of War. And finally, make sure you get onto the other show, Listen to War for Idiots, where myself and Rich try and take a less than serious approach at some of these more heady topics. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.